What's good, YouTube? Welcome back. Today is the LazyDaze Channel and we're back at it again with some more history reaction for you guys today, and we're on some Kings and Generals content for you, and we're on the First Crusade, and it's the People's Crusade, Battle of Civetot. Really looking forward to finding out what happens in this episode and enjoying this content in general. So if you have any other suggestions, please drop them in the comments box down below. If you're enjoying our content, then please like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell. But we're just going to jump straight into this one.
In our previous episode, we examined the elements and people who directly led to a unique call to arms aimed at aiding the Eastern Roman Empire on the way to reclaiming Jerusalem. This was a carefully planned endeavor, coordinated with the Emperor Alexios Komnenos, aimed at directing the martial prowess of the Frankish nobility towards a common enemy. But as Urban II sent out his bishops to spread his fiery speech, another man would pick up the mantle and irreversibly change the Christians' relations with a different religion. While Urban was still touring central and southern France, a man by the name of Peter the Hermit, inspired by the Pope, decided to launch his own campaign, carrying his own message and delivering it to a different target audience. Starting out in Berry, Peter began touring the urban centers of northern France, and before long, he captivated the hearts and minds of thousands of people. One of his supporters described him by writing, "Outdoors he wore a woolen tunic, which revealed his ankles, and above it a hood. He wore a cloak to cover his upper body and a bit of his arms, but his feet were bare. He drank wine and ate fish, but scarcely ever ate bread." Another eyewitness reports, "We saw him wander through cities and towns, spreading his teaching, surrounded by so many people, given so many gifts, and acclaimed for such great piety that I don't ever remember anyone equally honored.
Wow.
Whatever he did or said seemed like something almost divine. Even the hairs of his mule were torn out as though they were relics." Peter was an extremely charismatic preacher who told the story of how he visited Jerusalem a few years earlier and saw firsthand how the Muslims were mistreating the Christians and desecrating the holy sites. According to him, as he slept in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he received a vision of Christ, who handed him a round letter that instructed all Christendom from all parts of the world to take up arms and journey to Jerusalem to fight against the pagans and to claim eternal possession of the city with all its pertinent lands. There is no evidence that Peter ever made such a journey, but that didn't stop thousands from joining him as he travelled from one city to the next, warning that the last days were at hand, and that the Christians would have to travel to Jerusalem to battle the Antichrist. Compared to Urban's more moderate approach targeting the warrior class, Peter appealed to a larger group of people, mostly commoners, at a particularly sensitive moment in time. 1095 saw the occurrence of a meteor shower, an aurora borealis, a lunar eclipse, the passage of a comet, blood-colored clouds, and a number of fascinating stories.
Wow.
Some said that the Holy Roman Emperor...
Yeah, see, if all that's going on and your thought process is like you don't have the information we have nowadays, then you're going to think then there's something's changing and maybe you need to arm up. I do understand the thought process you would have if he was going throughout those times. You know, all these things happening, all these unexplainable things that you don't have the ability to explain like we do now. And then obviously this person who believes in Christ and you believe wholeheartedly in Christianity and in your God, then of course it would appeal to you and it would make sense and you would start believing it more.
Charlemagne had come back from the dead, ready to lead his people into Jerusalem. When word of the crusade began to spread, people began disfiguring and tattooing themselves, claiming miracles and divine signs. But
now that's just a bit too cult-like for me, you know, but then that sways into the cult-like mentality you had back then, you know, and that's why religion does so well, again, because of cult-like mentality that humans have, all humans have.
Arguably the largest contributor to the widespread frenzy was the ongoing series of plagues. If we take a look at the multiple and independent writers during this period, a trend starts to show. During the period between 1092 and 1095, there are over 40 mentions of plague, peaking in 1094 with 25 reported plagues, often accompanied by famine. Surrounded by Catholic imagery of damnation in the form of frescoes and grotesque sculptures, the notion of abandoning the little they had to journey to the land of milk and honey, that is how many Christians thought of the Holy Land, suddenly seemed like a great idea.
Okay.
Contrary to popular belief, the so-called People's Crusade had a large portion of nobles who joined Peter's group, and those nobles would be the ones who were in charge of the crusade and were about to unleash chaos on Germany. Still, it is important to mention that although there were some members of this movement who embarked on the journey for materialistic reasons, this was very much the exception rather than the norm. After passing through Champagne in March 1096, Peter moved into Lorraine before spending Easter in Cologne.
Okay.
He sent smaller parties to preach in the surrounding cities, while assembling a force of 15,000 men, women and children. Peter was joined by many minor nobles, among them Walter Sans-Souvois, Renaud of Bray, Geoffrey of Bourret.
One sec. So who is this? So is this Walter? He is mistakenly known as Walter the Penniless due to crude translation of his family name, which actually means fearless. Okay, so he's supposed to be Walter the Fearless.
Geoffrey of Bourrel and many others. The plan was to take the route towards Jerusalem, one which the local German populace was very aware of since the Great German Pilgrimage of 1064.
Okay.
This pilgrimage was led by a number of major German clerics, among them Archbishop Siegfried of Mainz, and although possibly thousands of pilgrims were killed by local Bedouins in Caesarea, most of them reached Jerusalem and returned home by sea. However, this was another big deviation from Urban's route and timing, which intended for the crusade to cross the Adriatic and land in Dyrrhachium on August 15, 1096, coinciding with the Byzantine harvest, a date Alexios Komnenos knew ahead of time and prepared for by sending vast amounts of grain merchants and Latin translators to the region.
Makes sense. So
Peter took the time to preach and
they were really thinking about it strategically, and then the People's Crusade really did just put that all into flux and just created chaos.
Cologne to recruit more German lords, but Walter was impatient and decided to leave as soon as the feast was over with a few thousand companions. As a result of this schism, the crusade was now divided into 5 groups, one under Peter, one commanded by Walter, and 3 more under the leadership of nobles, who distorted the words of the initial call even further and weaponized them against the thriving Jewish community. The series of events which we now call the Rhineland Massacres would become a turning point in history. This was not the first time when a minority was attacked by the majority, but the scale and nature of these attacks would mark a new chapter and set a precedent which would recur numerous times in the centuries to come. Contemporary scholars writing after the conquest of Jerusalem tried their best to put the blame on Peter or peasant greed, with the goal of distancing the more successful Prince's Crusade from the failed People's Crusade. But not because of the mass slaughter of the Jews, which the Church unilaterally saw as a grave sin, but because after many of them were forcibly baptized, they reconverted once the storm had passed.
Okay.
But how did this all start, and why did these 3 groups begin the rampage in the first place?
Really like a Kings&Genrals
Even before the army crossed the Rhine, word spread, proclaiming, "Do we need to travel to distant lands in the east to attack the enemies of God, when there are Jews right before our eyes, a race that is the greatest enemy of God? We've got it all backwards." Days went by as children asked their parents if this was Jerusalem at the sight of each new city, and the growing excitement turned into impatience. Most of the German nobles were busy fighting amongst each other, but some of them quickly became obsessed with the promise of indulgence in return for military service. Count Emicho of Leiningen added his own ideas to the crusade by tattooing a cross on himself and proclaiming that he was the last emperor, the one who would unite East and West, before going to Jerusalem and wiping out Judaism. His well-equipped and well-organized army unleashed a wave of violence, which began on May 3rd, 1096, at the newly settled city of Speyer by storming into the synagogue. The bishop of Speyer, who had heard of the coming danger, did everything he could to protect the Jewish populace, and as a result of his actions, only 11 of them were killed. 15 days later, Emmiko descended upon the city of Worms, where according to the Mainz Chronicle, they took a trampled corpse of theirs, which had been buried 30 days previously, and carried it through the city, saying, "Behold what the Jews have done to our comrade. They took a Gentile and boiled him in water. Then they poured the water into our wells in order to kill us."
That's just
Jews,
complete bullshit,
forewarned
right?
by the events in Speyer, had already sought the protection of the Bishop of Worms. They looked on from the sanctuary of his palace as those of their brethren that had chosen to remain at home were massacred. The Crusaders demanded that they convert, and those who did were spared, but the majority of them refused. Emmiko laid siege to the bishop's palace, and once his soldiers broke in, they discovered that the Jews inside had decided to take their own lives rather than fall to their hands. Only 5 days later, the band was already in Mainz, where once again the local archbishop took a massive amount of money in return for sheltering his Jewish citizens. At first, the rest of the populace rallied around the Jews, but after a 2-day siege, some of them opened the gates, which the Crusaders saw as a miracle. "Behold, the gates have opened by themselves. All this the crucified has done for us, so that we might avenge his blood on the Jews."
It's just, I'm a bit speechless because it's just disgusting what happens throughout history to races and to people with different beliefs, you know? It's just insane that this has happened and spun off of something, you know? The crusade was bad enough itself for going for the Muslim community and so on and so forth, but then for other communities to get sort of dragged into it as well. Yeah, it's just crazy. It's just crazy, but you see it throughout history, you know?
1,014 of them died in a single day. Hearing of this, the citizens of Cologne took action and massacred their own Jewish population, destroying every Torah scroll they found along the way, while other cities like Regensburg were spared after mass force.
So they're destroying every Torah scroll they found. I'm assuming that's going to be to do with the Judaism religion, but I'm not 100% sure. So if you guys do know, please let me know in the comments box down below, because I would like to know.
Along the way, while other cities like Regensburg were spared after mass forced conversions. The second group, under a monk named Volkmar, decided to pass through Bavaria and travel to Prague, inspiring another Jewish pogrom on June the 1st, while the Duke was away. Another group, with at least 15,000 followers, led by a man named Gottschalk, also committed atrocities as they made their way along the Danube. It is important to note that the majority of these leaders would later join the Prince's Crusade.
Godfrey of Bouillon, for example, is reported to have extorted 500 silver pieces from the Jews of Menzies in return for the promise of protection that he failed to fulfill. Great.
The Prince's Crusade, whose leaders also attacked members of the Jewish community. Meanwhile, Walter and around 10,000 Crusaders made it to the Hungarian border in May and met with King Koloman, who treated him well. But by the time they reached the Sava River, an accident occurred, involving 16 of Walter's men bartering with local weapons merchants before they were attacked and stripped of their clothes and valuables.
Wow.
The humiliated soldiers walked naked to the army camp, only to...
So obviously, the extra history, extra credits, and also I believe we also watched the Epic History TV version of this as well, covered this, but it all seemed like it was under Peter the Hermit. I'm liking how Kings&Generals was splitting up to different commanders, who's leading it, so on and so forth. I understand that Peter the Hermit has sort of rallied everyone together, but other people have been able to sort of control smaller contingents and do bits and pieces. So the atrocities that I sort of knew about, I'm finding out who done them and what for. So like this Clove little outbreak, I remember hearing something, I believe on extra credits series, but obviously we didn't know who to do it. So clearly it's Walter the Fearless or the Penniless that is the one that had caused this, which is really nice to sort of get that information and just getting that different point of view. And again, the animation style is really good.
Only to find that the governor of Belgrade refused to open his markets. In response, Walter plundered the countryside and rounded up as much cattle as he could in between skirmishes with the Hungarian and Byzantine border guards. At one point, 140 crusaders were routed and sought refuge in a chapel, which the Byzantines burned down. Eventually, the group made it to Niš, where they were granted weapons and supplies by the governor, who ensured their safe passage to Constantinople, promising open markets along the way.
Okay.
Peter the Hermit's contingent, which had as many as 40,000 followers, was only a few days behind Walter's. Upon their entry to Hungary, King Koloman made them swear to keep the peace, but as the Crusaders approached the Sava River, they spotted the clothes of 16 Crusaders hanging from the battlements of Zemun. This sight came at the same time as a rumor began to circulate that a local Hungarian warlord and the governor of Belgrade were plotting against them. After camping in front of the city for 17 days, Peter ordered an attack, instructing his archers to target the watchmen, while the infantry assaulted the walls with scaling ladders. According to one source, 4,000 Hungarians were killed at the cost of just 100 Crusaders.
Wow, really? Witnessing the brutal assault, the governor of Belgrade abandoned the city.
And whether the numbers were exaggerated or not, the city was taken and became their base for a week. By this time, Peter learned that the Hungarians were gathering an army, so he ordered his men to begin crossing the river, with 150 ships and rafts made from timber stripped from the houses and bound with rope. While the people and supplies were being ferried, 7 boats filled with Pecheneg archers approached and opened fire. A makeshift Frankish navy grouped up and attempted to counterattack, destroying all the enemy vessels, but their cohesion was significantly damaged.
Wow.
As they arrived at Niš, a deal was struck, exchanging high-ranking hostages in return for access to the local markets. But it didn't take long for hostilities to resume. A group of soldiers were dissatisfied with another group of merchants and decided to set fire to several mills and houses just outside the city, as the Crusaders were already on the road. In response, the governor launched a raid on the rear, mostly made up of the elderly men, women, and children. Cattle were stolen. Dozens were killed or captured before the rest of the column could even react. Peter could not let this go unpunished, so he turned his army around and attempted to negotiate. His followers, however, were uninterested in peace, and 2,000 young men attacked the city without any semblance of a plan. The garrison managed to hold out against the attack, repelling them with arrows and other projectile weapons, and once the Crusaders retreated, the troops sallied out.
Peter really didn't have any control over the army he's leading at all. I mean, 2,000 men just decided to attack, like, with no thought process either. It's absolutely stupid.
The disjointed and broken army was now in full flight, and many drowned in the river. Men, women, and children fell prey to the Byzantines, who managed to capture most of their goods, including a wagon filled with gold and silver. The Crusaders scattered into the nearby forests, but miraculously, only a quarter of them were lost in the battle. However, that included a good portion of the fighting men, as well as most of their provisions. On July 12th, Peter reached Serdica and met with imperial emissaries, who ensured that there was no trouble for the remainder of the journey, and that the army was well supplied. A generous gesture which showed both the commitment and preparation of Alexios Komnenos.
Yeah.
The next group to reach Hungary was that of Folkmar, but after a brawl broke out in the capital, The army quickly responded by killing and enslaving anyone who failed to escape. Then came Gottschalk's contingent, and this time the Hungarian king kept them at Moson for a prolonged period of time, and a Hungarian merchant was impaled after a failed bargain. Battle lines were drawn, but neither side wanted to engage, so after a prolonged stare-down, the Hungarians proposed a truce. If indeed you surrender them to the king with all the money you have, you might soothe his anger and find grace in his eyes. But if you do otherwise, not one of you will stand before his face or go on living, since you have committed such contumacy and calumny in his kingdom. The Crusaders agreed, and as soon as they were disarmed, the Hungarians put them to the sword. Finally,
Peak! Oh no! As if! That's so peak! They got disarmed and then put to the sword straight away. Wow.
Ko's army crossed into Hungary, but Koloman refused to even deal with them. So the Crusaders decided to lay siege to the capital and devastated the countryside. There were numerous skirmishes while bridges and catapults were built, and finally 2 breaches were opened on August 15, 1096. While the king was preparing to flee, the defenders organized a desperate last stand as the Franks poured in. The tides turned, and the knights were routed. Those who were well equipped and mounted managed to escape, while the rest were vanquished.
Wow. Most of the senior officers would later join the contingent of the Hugh of Vermundus while they returned home. I'm assuming the other person's name I can't pronounce. Hugh of Vermandos is one of the nobles that is going to go with later on in the crusade.
Back in Constantinople, Peter finally met up with Walter's contingent and personally met with Alexios, who was instantly impressed by the charismatic hermit. The number of crusaders was significant, but there were little more than 500 knights and a few thousand footmen, as most of the fighters were lost along the way fighting Hungarians and Byzantines, so the emperor advised that they wait for reinforcements outside the city walls. This was seen as a grave insult to the thousands of people who had travelled all this way and were now prevented from seeing some of the most holy sites in Christendom, so naturally more looting occurred. According to Anna Komnena's Alexiad, the Christians behaved abominably. They sacked and burned palaces of the city and stole the lead from church roofs so that they could sell it back to the Greeks.
What?
Despite his lack of confidence, Alexios knew that his guests couldn't stay long, so they were ferried across to Anatolia on the 6th of August.
What?
Once on the Asiatic shore, they began attacking in all directions, usually Christians living under the Seljuks, pillaging houses and churches all the way to Nicomedia, which was deserted since its sack 15 years earlier, and was converted to their new base of operations. The Romans kept a steady supply of grain ships, selling provisions at a fair price to it, and the other base at Civetot. But months went by without much progress, and the coins were starting to run out. On October the 1st, Peter decided to go back to Constantinople in hopes of striking a new deal with Alexios, and in his absence, a rift formed between the Frankish knights on one side and the German and Italian knights on the other.
Okay.
As animosity grew, the latter group decided to leave Civetot and raid as far as Nicaea on their own. The once great Roman city was now the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, ruled by Kilij Arslan. The Nicaean garrison charged out, but was defeated by the knights, who despite their lack of leadership, had some of the best training and equipment money could buy. After the Turks were repelled, they headed towards the nearby castle of Zerigordos, which they quickly captured, sparing only its Christian population. The castle had plenty of grain, meat and wine, but was a signal to the Turks that this was not a threat they could deal with easily. 3 days later, Kilij Arslan made his way towards it, defeating an ambush laid by the Italian contingent along the way. siege lines were drawn and the unyielding Christians were cut off from the rest of their allies. The only two sources of fresh water nearby were located outside the castle walls and guarded by the Seljuks. As the days dragged on, the Crusaders began to drink their own urine and sewage water. Some of them buried themselves in the sand in the hope of retaining moisture, or tried to suck water out of the dry earth. On the 8th day, the gate was set on fire, causing a wild panic. Some surrendered, while others jumped, sallied out, and were assaulted with arrows. Only a few Germans managed to survive.
What fools.
Back in the camp, Peter was still negotiating, while a Turkish spy told the Crusaders that Nicaea had fallen and that the Crusaders were dividing up the loot between themselves. Once again, the Christians were divided, with some advising to wait for their leader, while the rest wanted to act now. A decision was made that all the fighting men would deploy in 6 divisions and move towards Nicaea, while the women, children and sick stayed in Civetot. Somewhere along the way, the truth was revealed and excitement turned into panic, which only multiplied as Kilij Arslan's army ambushed them from the woods just 3 miles away from the camp. No formations were drawn. Instead, each of the divisions rallied themselves and attacked the far more mobile enemy. The horse archers employed hit-and-run tactics before encircling 2 of the divisions, while another group of Turkish cavalry circled around to cut off their retreat. The remaining 4 divisions charged forward as the Seljuks fired at them in a classic feigned retreat. Initially, the situation looked hopeful, as the mounted knights took down hundreds of their opponents, but then the Turks aimed at their horses, which led to a massacre. There were only a few survivors, which did not include Walter Sansavoix, who had 7 arrows sticking out of him. The remainder was chased down to Civetot. The camp followers lit bonfires, which were carried by the winds into the enemy, but the situation was hopeless. Tens of thousands who were inspired by Peter now ran for their lives. Many of them drowned or were killed, but most were captured. Those who refused to convert were taken captive and carted to Antioch, Aleppo, and as far as Khorasan. 3,000 managed to reach a nearby ruined castle and hold off the attackers with improvised fortifications. The following day, a single boat managed to reach Constantinople, prompting Alexios to send his fleet and rescue a fragment of the people who initially set out from France.
What happens
Anna Komnena's description of the dead no doubt exaggerated their numbers, but it nonetheless provides a good sense of how the slaughter must have looked to the next wave of Crusaders arriving 9 months later. When they gathered the remains of the fallen lying on every side, they heaped up, I will not say a mighty ridge or hill or peak, but a mountain of considerable height and depth and width, so huge was the mass of bones. But this was not the end of the First Crusade, and in the next episode, we'll talk about the beginning of the Prince's Crusade. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely.
I really enjoyed that episode and finding out some more, and like I said, the details about the People's Crusade that King&General went into that the other channels haven't. I really enjoyed that, a lot more details. Very, very good. If you're enjoying our content, then please like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell. But we're just gonna, and we will catch you in the next video.